Hi, welcome to my presentation for Psychology for Dancers. Today I'm going to be looking at perfectionism. Hi, I'm Lottie, and in this presentation I'll be covering the meanings and effects of perfectionism and how it's personally affected my training as a dance student. Doing this presentation will allow me to understand where I lie in my prime dance journey, as well as know what I can apply to my future training to strengthen my psychological approaches to dance, which will then hopefully positively affect my physical training as well. So, some definitions of perfectionism. Hollinger in 1978 stated that is the practice where you demand yourself or others of a higher quality in performance, and more than that is required in the current situation. So, for an example, setting a standard to become a cruise ship dancer when you're 18. Sometimes that is possible for some students, but for me personally, that was something that I can't achieve until I've at least finished my uni training. Frost in 1990 additionally describes perfectionism as when you set yourself personal goals that are unattainable and standards for a performance that are unreachable. So this is more as well thinking of yourself to be able to achieve or become the impossible. So the two sides of perfectionism. The first one is maladaptive. So Stober and Otto in 2006 suggest that maladaptive perfectionism is when someone's perfectionism has more of a negative effect on them, and they do not believe that anything they can do can reach the standards that they've set for themselves because they only allow no or little no room for their mistakes. This is mainly because they visualise their personal mistakes as more of a setback, something that's stopping them from achieving any goals in their training, because it just is the worst case scenario. Some other aspects of maladaptive perfectionism is doubts about actions, rumination and guilt. So sometimes thinking weeks before you've done a competition or some days before you turn up to a class, you're already worrying about the mistakes you're going to make, even though you could go to that class or you could do that competition and it could all go amazing. But sometimes that could also cause lack of attendance to those things as well, because some dancers rather just not turn up or not do the task or not do the exercise than do it and possibly make a mistake. They're also highly critical. They have highly critical views on their own personal performance, which can sometimes, it's more of on a spectrum, but it can become obsessive when critiquing themselves, which can cause heightened feelings of guilt and anger towards their mistakes, which in the long term can then trigger episodes of depression and anxiety, which is I've also taken from Burns in 1980. It's just more to the point where you, instead of going, oh, I didn't get that leg high enough, it's more of oh, my head was looking too much to the side, or more of everything. Sometimes when you, instead of looking at the mistake as a whole, you're looking at every single detail of your whole body during that one mistake and to try and figure out how you can completely avoid it when sometimes it is just an accident. And with maladaptive perfectionism, it's mainly self or socially motivated, or orientated, which is what I'll move on to in a minute. But whereas on the other side, perfectionism can also be good. So on the other hand, Strober and Otto in 2006 also suggest that perfectionism can be positively adaptive to the dancer's training. So adaptive perfectionists are more optimistic with their goal setting and more flexible when critiquing their own performances and the standards that they want to achieve. This is mainly because they see their mistakes as areas of development, or they are this is room for me to progress as a dancer instead of a setback. It's a stepping stone. Other aspects of an adaptive perfectionist is increased levels of motivation and determination. So let's say they try a triple turn but they fall out of it. They might have been I've never tried that before. I will have another go next week, just train a little bit more, and then I can achieve it, and then maybe I can push for is it a quadruple turn? So 4 rotations. They're more focused on organisation, planning and structure, so it's less about that are physical mistakes. It's more about making sure everything's in line and, you know, they turn up to class on time so they can get that full amount of training that they want or that they've been given. And even though it's a positive side of perfectionism, it is also self-orientated because it's more about doing stuff for themselves, perfecting stuff for like their goals, because they know that when they clean stuff and when they're more organised with their life or with their training, they'll achieve those long-term goals that they have set for themselves. So this is where I move on to multidimensional perfectionism, which is stated by Hewitt and Flett in 1991. So even though perfectionism factors can be split into maladaptive or adaptive, perfectionism nowadays is seen more as a scale. In the 20th century, Hewitt and Flett in 1989 and 1991 divided perfectionism into 3 categories. So self-orientated, where your perfectionist behaviour is more focused on yourself. So there is no what about what they're doing, what about what they've asked for me. It's more about what did I do wrong, what do I need to do to get better. It's more just yourself. There's, on the other hand though, there is other orientated, so when your perfectionism is so you can please others, so you can please the standards that people set for you, or sometimes even the standards that you think people set for you. You know, you might have teachers that are like, they're just normal teachers, and you think, oh, I must do this because if I don't, so-and-so, teacher A won't like me anymore. So something that they might not even said, but you might think, oh, I need to reach the standard that they want from me. And then finally, there's socially prescribed, when your perfectionistic behaviour is to avoid social conflict. So, for example, for losing a competition, or, you know, causing disturb for others. It can be mistaken for other orientated, but it's more as like achieving like social goals, if that makes sense. So looking at this, I decided to more understand my perfectionism for myself. I took these 2 questionnaires, one by Hewitt and Flett from 1990 and one from Frost, which is also from 1990. So they're both multi-dimensional scales, multi-dimensional perfectionism scales. But Hewitt and Flett's scale looks into what the perfectionism is orientated by, so if it's self-orientated, other-orientated, or socially prescribed, like I just talked about. Whereas that's more of an overall categorization, whereas Frost's scale is much more specific, exploring what in our lives could motivate perfectionism, such as concern over mistakes or concern over parents' expectations. So it's more day-to-day or like life topics that can motivate that perfectionism, instead of just kind of categorising what part of society or whether it's you that it falls under. It's more specific to the situation. So when I did these, my results said that in Hewitt and Flett's multidimensional scale, I scored 97 in self-orientated, 68 in other-orientated, and socially prescribed I scored 76. So overall I am a more self-orientated perfectionist, but it doesn't mean that the other 2 should be ignored. Yes, I would need to work more on my self-orientated perfectionism, but it also doesn't mean that that's it, if that makes sense. It's more of a variety which falls under for everyone. Everyone will have, you know, higher and lower scores, but when you're a perfectionist in the slightest of ways, and mainly in dancers, it will come across all 3 categories. And then Frost, my multidimensional perfectionism scale, my main reason why I'm a perfectionist is concern over mistakes, and also with high personal standards as well. So that kind of comes under the 2. Sometimes I will set a goal, for example, like, oh, I'm going to do a triple turn when I know I can't. So then I make those, but then I'm like, oh, but then what if I make a mistake? I can't do that. Which kind of means I do have a self-orientated maladaptive perfectionism. Yes, I do have adaptive perfectionist like factors, that it is mainly more maladaptive. But this leads into my reviews for my training journals, and how my perfectionism is perceived through my weekly reflections, not just on my bigger performances but on my class training. So when I went back looking through my training journals, I discovered that I mainly, when I would write them, I would mainly look at my areas of development, but instead of seeing them as those stepping stones, I would see them more as mistakes and setbacks. I'm a lot more hyper-focused on those mistakes and what I need to do to fix them, even though, like I just said, they are areas of development. They're not fallbacks, they're not holdbacks, they are just something that I need to progress on, because if I was perfect all the time, there would be no need for training. And whereas when I looked at those achievements, they'd be like 2 sentences compared to the paragraphs of my mistakes I had wrote. My achievements would just be more of a passing note, like, oh yeah, I did that double turn well, and then that would be it. Where it's like, oh yeah, that should be the normal. That shouldn't be like awarded. That's how it should be anyways. That's the standard I've set for myself. I shouldn't be going any lower than that anyways. I should be doing more. And then further on, I was not resting. So then in my training journals, I'd write about how I became injured. But because where I wasn't resting, my injuries then become worse. And I was just dancing in more pain and more pain. And then because of this, it did stop me from being able to dance as full as I know I could. And not being able to dance fully then irritated and annoyed me, because I couldn't dance to my said perfect level, which was just as irritating. I would, sometimes think about the mistakes I've made before going into class, and then maybe be like, oh, there's just no point going. But then I would fight against wanting to train even more. And then I would also, because I became less motivated to go to those classes, I then kind of experienced an acute burnout, which is just like a further effect of perfectionism and what I'm about to talk about, overtraining. I would also further notice in external rehearsals, I would push myself further, even though I know I should have rested. There was that little voice saying, you need to rest, you're fine, you don't need to change anything. But then it was also to avoid social conflict. I didn't want to let my teammates down right before competitions by resting, which is a crazy thing to think about. But yeah, so that was kind of fell under more both socially and other orientated perfectionism, because I was like, if I let my teammates down, then we'll lose. It kind of one led to the other. So then this is when I move on to my overtraining. So after reviewing my training journals, I discovered that some of my perfectionism had caused me to experience overtraining. So Carr and Wine in 2003 had found studies that performers with perfectionism can additionally experience exercise addiction, where they become so obsessed with perfecting their art that the training that they complete to become better turns into something harmful. So it's, even though I hadn't experienced overtraining to an obsessive amount, like I said in my training journals, it got to the point where I have got injuries that haven't healed due to not having a balance between resting and training, and also rehabilitation with illness and injuries. So some further effects of overtraining. Rachel Fine said in 2024 that fatigue, an effect of overtraining is fatigue that doesn't get resolved with rest and sleep. So sometimes I would feel like I'm sleeping for hours, I'd be having really long naps in the day, and I just would not feel like any better. I just constantly feel tired. There's a higher risk of injury from the continued stress and strain on the muscles and joints. So sometimes with my injuries, it wasn't really, oh, I pulled a muscle, or I've broken a bone. It was my body was fighting against itself. So, because while I was overworking it so much, the only way my body could tell me to stop was by being in pain. And on top of this, Rachel Fine also said in 2024 that a weakened immune system can be caused that makes dancers more susceptible to illness. And then Champion in 2023 had stated that some further effects of overtraining can include decreased strength, decreased endurance and stamina, anxiety, depression and irritability. So like anxiety can, for example, be when you're not training, when you have fallen under the effects of overtraining, it can cause issues when your body's physically telling you not to dance, and when you do give in and listen to it, then your mind's like, I need to be training, this break is too long, I'm going to fall behind my classmates, etc. But on top of this, some of these effects, such as decreased strength and mainly a weakened immune system, and like risk of injury, can also be caused by because those who overtrain can additionally suffer with a decrease in their appetite, which can restrict them from gaining the right nutrients and proteins to not just, be able to have the energy to dance and, burn the fat, or, what you need for those, like, long rehearsals or long classes, but to also recover and also heal. That was also not being able to eat, or like a decrease in appetite was also stated by Rachel Fine. It also means that when you're so focused on perfecting something, luckily I don't think it got to this point with me, but you can forget your needs, you can forget your daily needs, such as eating, and for some people sometimes sleeping, because all you can think about is achieving those goals, which are sometimes not achievable. So a way I thought I could develop or progress my perfectionism into a more positive mindset is by using imagery. So imagery is a systematic use of mental imaging, imaging, as a means to psychologically prepare for a dance activity, i.e. An audition, competition or performance, and it's to practice movement material, promote or reinforce feelings associated with a dance situation. So there have been studies before that there are negative effects of imagery with perfectionism. Frost and Henderson have found that sometimes dancers find that too many thoughts could fog the dancer's memory and frustrate them from visualising perfectionism. It can also be that sometimes they can only imagine themselves as perfect. That's the only thing they can picture. They can't, picture more achievable goals. It's more of a closed-minded process. Or imagery can then further feed into that hyperfixation on possibility of mistakes, because sometimes if some dancers can imagine themselves in their room, not even in a dance situation, making those mistakes, it doesn't really do good for their perfectionism. However, there are some positive effects of imagery with perfectionism, such as help mentally prepare you if you do make those mistakes, kind of then visualising how you can not make that anger you and see that more of a positive thing. And Weigert in 2012 stated that perfectionism has a greater impact on creative motivation, so it can help dancers visualise these brilliant detailed performances because they think of all the different aspects of it. And I do want to use this a lot more, because looking at the ways I work around my perfectionism, I wanted to look at imagery. The main reason why I wanted to look at imagery was because goal setting, which is another way you can improve psychological aspects, it is a main reason why I'm a perfectionist, whereas I can clearly imagine myself in performance and classes. So I wanted to see if it was possible to change my perfectionism into something that can be more adaptive to my environment, because perfectionism doesn't have to be bad. So I thought I'm going to apply this to my training now, especially before I go into my practical assessments and my second year, because it will be so much more helpful for me in my future. So to conclude my psychological presentation, looking back on my analysis on my perfectionism, I've now understood that across my training I have and still currently experience aspects of maladaptive perfectionism. However, even though through studies some studies have shown uses of like imagery that can be negative and contributed to a dancer's imagery badly, it can also develop and open a dancer's mindset to visualise and notice all the things they could and have already achieved, which will then, as me personally, would fully motivate me and make me believe that actually these little mistakes that I make in classes aren't the end of the world. And that, yes, sometimes I might lose a competition, but that's progression for the next one. But yeah, I just wanted to say a quick thank you for listening and reading or hearing about my perfectionism and the stuff I've discovered. So yeah, and then there is all my references to where I have found all my knowledge and all my lovely facts about